The harvest moon rose orange that night. Jakob did not look up at it. He was washing one plate at the sink. The kettle on the stove began to hum. Then the kitchen door opened on its own. She was standing there in the doorway. Jakob did not drop the plate, though his fingers tightened on the rim until the knuckles went white. He had seen her 7 times before, every harvest moon for 7 years, and still the sight of her stopped his breath. Her skin was the color of deep violet dusk, threaded with faint silver lines that pulsed slowly like the breathing of something asleep beneath a still lake. She wore a long traveling cloak the color of wet slate. She said nothing. She closed the door behind her with the careful slowness of someone who had once been hunted. Her eyes, gold and slitted like a cat's at midday, moved across the kitchen the way they always did. First the kettle, then the chair by the window, then the worn place on the floorboard where Jakob had stood for 40 years. Only after all of that did her eyes finally rest on him. She inclined her head a fraction of an inch. Jakob nodded back because that was what he had learned to do. He set the plate down on the drying rack with both hands, the way an old man does when his fingers no longer trust themselves. He did not speak. He had spoken on the first year, and the second, and the third, and she had never answered. So now he simply moved aside and let her come to the chair by the window where she always sat. She crossed the kitchen without sound. Her boots, when they touched the floorboards, made no creak, though Jakob himself could not walk that stretch without the wood complaining beneath him. She sat down in the chair, folded her hands in her lap, and looked out at the wheat fields silvered by the orange moon. The faint silver lines along her cheekbones brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, in time with some slow rhythm he could not name. Jakob turned back to the stove. He took down 2 cups from the cupboard. He poured tea into both, the same bitter root tea his mother had taught him to brew when he was a boy on this same farm. He set 1 cup on the small table beside her chair, exactly the distance she had accepted on the 3rd year, after refusing it on the first 2. Then he carried his own cup to the table and sat down with the slow groan of an old man's knees. For a long while, neither of them moved. The kettle ticked as it cooled. Somewhere out in the field, a nightbird called twice and was answered once. The harvest moon climbed a little higher in the window, and the silver lines on her face pulsed a little slower. Jakob watched the steam rise from his cup. He thought about his wife, dead 12 years now, and about the way she would have stared at this woman with quiet, unjudging eyes. He did not know what she was. He had decided, on the 2nd year, that he did not need to know. The papers and the news strips that came up the dirt road once a week spoke of strange things in the skies, of treaties signed with peoples whose names the announcers could not pronounce. Jakob had stopped listening to them a long time ago. The wheat needed cutting whether the empires fell or stood. The chickens did not care who ruled the stars. She lifted the cup at last. She held it close to her face, breathing in the steam, her eyes half closing. The faint silver threads along her temples brightened to something almost white. Jakob had learned to read this small sign. It meant she was, in whatever way her people felt such things, at ease. He took a sip of his own tea. The bitterness sat on his tongue the way it always did, sharp and clean and familiar. The first year she had come, he had been afraid. He remembered that fear now, without shame. He had been alone in the kitchen, washing a single plate, and the door had opened, and there she had stood, tall and strange and dripping rain. He had reached for the iron poker by the stove. She had seen the gesture and not moved. She had only stared at him with those gold cat eyes until he set the poker down. She had walked past him then, that first year, the way she walked past him every year since. She had crossed the kitchen, sat in the chair by the window, and stared out at the wheat field for almost 2 hours. She had not eaten what he offered. She had not drunk what he poured. She had not spoken a word. At dawn, she had stood, opened the door, and walked back out into the receding mist. On the 2nd year, he'd been ready with bread and salt and a folded blanket, the small offerings his grandmother had taught him to give to strangers. She had ignored them all. She had sat in the chair. She had looked at the wheat. She had left at dawn. On the 3rd year, he had simply poured the tea, and she had drunk it, and something in the room had changed, though he could not have said what. Now, 7 years on, the tea was a ritual. So was the chair. So was the silence. So was the long, slow climb of the harvest moon across his kitchen window. Jakob had stopped trying to understand. He had stopped trying to find a word for what she was, or for what they were to each other. He simply set out the second cup on the night of the harvest moon, and every year, without fail, she came. The candle on the table burned low between them. She did not look at him. She rarely did, in those long quiet hours. Her gaze stayed on the field, the wheat moving like slow water under the orange light. And sometimes Jakob thought she was looking past it, through the field and the hills, to somewhere far beyond his farm. He wondered, not for the first time, if she came here to remember something, or to forget it. He cleared his throat softly, not to speak, just to remind his old body it still could. She did not turn, but the silver threads along her jaw brightened a touch, the way they always did when he made a small sound. She heard him. She had always heard him. He had come to understand, over the years, that her silence was not indifference. It was a stillness he did not yet have a word for. Jakob shifted in his chair and reached for the small wooden box on the shelf behind him. Inside were photographs, brown at the edges, of his wife and his son, and the dog they had once owned, and the harvest of 43 years ago, when the wheat had come in so heavy the barn had nearly split. He did not take any of them out. He only laid his hand on the box for a moment, then drew it back. She was watching him now. She had turned her head just a little and was watching his hand on the box. The gold of her eyes had darkened slightly, the way a deep pool darkens when a cloud passes overhead. She did not ask what was inside. She had never asked anything, but there was something in the angle of her face and the small downward tilt of her chin that made Jakob feel she already knew. He let his hand fall away. She returned her gaze to the window. Outside, the wheat moved in a slow ripple as a breath of wind crossed the field. The orange moon had reached its highest point and was beginning the long, slow fall toward the western hills. Jakob took another sip of his tea. He thought of his son, gone 26 years now, buried beneath the apple tree by the south fence. He thought of how his wife had asked, before she died, that he not be alone forever. The silver threads along the Empress's collarbone pulsed once, slowly, and then again. She set her cup down on the small table. The cup was empty. In 7 years it had taken her 3 years to drink 1 cup of tea, and now she finished it in the first hour. Jakob did not refill it. That was part of the ritual too. 1 cup, 1 night, 1 year between. The rules were hers, even if she had never said them aloud. The night bird called again, outside, and this time it was not answered. Jakob listened to the silence after it. It felt heavier than usual, the way air sometimes felt heavy before a storm, though the sky was clear. He looked at her sidelong. The silver lines along her temples were no longer pulsing in their slow, steady rhythm. They were flickering, faintly, like a flame in a small, uncertain wind. Something was different this year. He had learned not to ask. He had learned that questions were not part of what they had built between them. Still, his old farmer's instinct, the one that knew when a cow was sick before she fell, the one that knew when rain was coming before the clouds gathered, told him that something in her had shifted. He set his cup down very carefully. He folded his hands on the table. He waited. She did not move for a long time. The moon dropped lower in the window. The shadows in the kitchen lengthened across the floorboards, and the candle guttered in Jakob's old back began to ache from sitting so still. But he did not move either. He had the strange, certain feeling that if he moved, she would leave, and that this year, for some reason he could not name, leaving would mean something it had not meant before. At last her lips parted. The faint silver threads at her throat brightened sharply, then dimmed, as though she had drawn breath to speak and then thought better of it. She closed her mouth again. Her eyes did not leave the window. Jakob felt his heart move in his chest the way it had not moved in many years, a slow, uncertain beat like a bird testing whether it could still fly. The silence held. The moon dropped a little further, and then, very softly, in a voice like wind moving through a dry barn, she said one word in her own tongue. Jakob did not know the word. He did not know what it meant, but the sound of it made his eyes sting, and he did not know why, and he did not look away from the candle between them. She did not say anything else. She did not turn to see if he had heard, but the silver threads along her arms and her throat and her cheekbones had all begun to pulse in a new rhythm, slower and deeper, and Jakob understood, in the wordless way old men come to understand such things, that something had been given, something small, something that, for her, was not small at all. He did not try to repeat the word. He had learned, over 7 years, that some things were not meant to be answered. He only nodded once, slowly, the way he had nodded the first year when she had stepped through his door. Then he stood, careful of his bad knee, and went to the stove. He filled the kettle again. He set it back on the heat. He came back and sat down. She watched him do all of this. He felt her watching, though he did not look up. When he was seated again, she lowered her eyes to her empty cup on the table beside her. Then, very slowly, she lifted the cup and held it out toward him. It was a small motion. It was the smallest motion. But in 7 harvest moons, she had never once asked for a second cup. Jakob took the cup from her hand. His fingers brushed hers for the briefest moment, and he was surprised, as he had been the first year he had accidentally touched her sleeve, by how cold her skin was. Not the cold of fear or of sickness. The cold of something that lived in a colder place than this kitchen, and a colder place than this world. He carried the cup to the stove without speaking. When he came back with it filled, she had folded her hands in her lap again. She did not look at him as he set the cup down. She did not look at him as he sat, but the silver threads along her face were still pulsing in that new, deeper rhythm. And somewhere in the wheat field, the night bird called twice, and this time, faintly, something in the far hills called back. She drank the second cup slowly. The candle burned down another half-inch. The moon rested now on the line of the western hills, fat and orange and patient, and Jakob watched it the way he had watched it every harvest of his life. He thought of his father, who had farmed this land before him. He thought of his grandfather, who had built this kitchen by hand. He thought of all the silent guests neither of them had ever known to expect. The Empress finished her second cup. She set it down without a sound. For a moment she did not move at all. Then she did something she had never done in 7 years. She turned her head fully away from the window and looked at him. Her gold eyes met his old gray ones. There was no smile on her face, but the lines around her mouth had softened. Jakob felt his throat tighten. She held his gaze for a long count of breaths. Then she lifted her hand and, with the side of one long finger, touched the back of his hand where it rested on the table. The touch was light and brief and cold. But it was a touch. After 7 years of nothing but presence, it was a touch. After 7 years of nothing but presence, Jakob could not have spoken if she had asked him to. He only let his hand stay still. She withdrew her hand. She rose from the chair. The faint silver threads along her body brightened as she stood, then dimmed back to their resting glow. She crossed the kitchen with that same soundless step, and Jakob followed her with his eyes, his old body still in the chair, his old heart loud in his ears. She stopped at the door. She rested her hand on the frame. She did not turn. She said something else then, very softly in her own tongue. 2 words this time. They were spoken without ceremony, almost without breath, the way a person speaks a name they have carried for a long time alone. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the silver grass, and the door closed quietly behind her, and Jakob sat in the kitchen with 2 empty cups and the smell of bitter root tea and could not move for a long time. When he finally stood, his knees creaked badly, and he was surprised to find that he was weeping. He had not wept in many years. He had not wept when his wife was buried, nor when his son had been brought home. He had thought that part of him was used up, but now he stood in the kitchen with the harvest moon falling and felt the slow, warm slide of tears and a face that did not know what to do with them. He washed the 2 cups. He washed them carefully. He set them on the drying rack side by side, the way he set them every year. He blew out the candle. He turned off the kettle. He stood for a moment in the dark kitchen and listened to the wheat moving in the field. Then he went to bed and he did not sleep, but he lay in the dark and watched the ceiling and felt that something had begun. The next morning, the harvest began as it always began. Jakob walked the rows of wheat with his old machine humming behind him, and the dust rose up in the cool air, and the dog from the next farm came barking along the fence the way she did every year. The world had not changed. The work was the work. The bread would be bread. But somewhere inside his chest, a thing he had thought long dead was beating again, slowly, gently, like a bird testing a healed wing. He told no one. There was no one to tell. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles down the dirt road, and the nearest town twice that. And the people who came to buy his grain in the autumn had no patience for stories about cold-handed visitors and violet skin. He had kept the secret for 7 years. He would keep it for as long as it was his to keep. The land was good at keeping secrets, and Jakob had learned to be good at it too. But that morning, walking the rows, he found himself stopping more often than usual. He stopped to look at the way the light fell across the hills. He stopped to listen to the night bird's distant relative calling in the daylight. He stopped once by the apple tree at the south fence where his son was buried and stood there with his hat in his hand for longer than he meant to. The silver threads on her face came back to him each time he closed his eyes. The harvest ran late that year. The grain came in heavy, the way it had not come in since his grandfather's last good summer, and Jakob worked from before sunrise to after the second moon's rise. His back ached, his hands cracked. The kitchen filled with the smell of bread and dust and bitter tea. He cooked for himself and ate at the small table and looked, more often than he should have, at the empty chair by the window. A month passed, then another. The harvest moon faded into autumn and autumn into the first cold rains. Jakob mended the fence along the north field. He oiled the door hinges. He chopped wood until the woodshed was full, then chopped more and stacked it under the eaves. He was preparing, though he did not let himself say for what. The next harvest moon was still 10 months away. He worked anyway, the way old men work when their hands need somewhere to put their hope. In the second month of cold, a strange thing happened. A small flying craft, no bigger than a wagon, came down out of the gray sky and landed in his lower pasture. Jakob saw it from the kitchen window. He set down his cup. He took his coat from the peg by the door. He walked down through the wet grass with his old rifle slung over his shoulder, the way his father had taught him to greet anything he did not yet understand. The figure who climbed out of the craft was not the Empress. It was a small, slim creature of the same violet skin, but without the silver lines, and dressed in a uniform of deep blue cloth bordered in gold. The creature bowed to him from across the pasture very low, with both hands pressed against its chest. Jakob stopped. He lowered the rifle slowly. He waited. The small creature approached him through the wet grass. When it was close enough to speak, it did so in halting human words, with the careful slowness of someone who had practiced each sound many times. "Farmer Jakob," it said, I am sent to ask a question from the one who comes to your kitchen." Jakob's old heart did something he had not felt it do in a very long time. He inclined his head. He did not trust his voice yet. The small creature waited, watching his face with eyes that were not gold but a pale milky blue, the eyes of one of her servants perhaps, or one of her people of lower rank. Jakob did not know the orders of her world. He had never wanted to. He had only ever known the chair by the window and the empty cup on the small table. "The question," the small creature said with great care, "is this: may she come again, not at the harvest moon, may she come in other months, in other ways, to sit, to drink, to not speak." The small creature paused, watching his face for any sign of refusal, the way a child watches the face of a parent before asking for a thing it is sure it should not have. Jakob did not answer at first. His past the small creature, past the craft in the lower pasture, past the gray sky to the line of the hills that had bounded his world for 71 years. He thought of his wife. He thought of his son. He thought of the harvest moons he had counted and the cups he had washed, and the 7 years of silence that had not been silence at all. He looked down at the small creature. "Tell her," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to, the voice of a man who had not used it for anything important in too long. "Tell her the door is not locked. Tell her the kettle is on the stove. Tell her she does not need a moon to find her way to the kitchen." The small creature's pale eyes brightened. It bowed again, even lower than before, both hands flat against its chest. Then it turned and hurried back across the pasture to the small craft, and the craft rose silently into the gray sky and was gone. Jakob stood for a long time in the wet grass with his rifle slung and his old coat dripping. Then he turned and walked back up to the house. He put the kettle on the stove. He sat down in his chair and waited. She did not come that day. She did not come the next. 3 weeks passed before he heard the door open softly while he was reading by the fire. He did not look up at first. He had imagined the sound so many times in those 3 weeks that he no longer trusted his ears. But the floorboard near the door creaked, And that was a sound he could trust because she never made the floorboards creak. It was not her. It was a small child of her kind. The child stood just inside the door, no taller than Jakob's hip, dressed in a small gray cloak the same color as the Empress's. The child's skin was a paler violet, almost lavender, and the silver lines along its arms were not yet fully formed. The child looked up at Jakob with gold-flecked eyes and said nothing at all. Jakob set down his book very slowly. He did not stand. He did not call out. He looked at the child the way he had once looked at a fawn that had wandered into his garden, with the kind of stillness that did not frighten small wild things. The child watched him back. Then, after a long moment, the child crossed the kitchen, climbed up into the chair by the window, and folded its small hands in its lap. Jakob stood at last, careful of his knee, and went to the stove. He poured 2 cups of bitter root tea. He carried one to the child and set it on the small table at exactly the distance the Empress accepted. The child looked at the cup. The child looked at Jakob. Then the child reached out one small lavender hand and curled its fingers around the cup the way Jakob had seen the Empress do, 7 harvest moons in a row. The child did not drink. The child only held the cup and looked out at the field, and let the silver lines along its small arms brighten and dim in that same slow rhythm. Jakob sat down in his chair across the kitchen. He folded his hands. He did not ask whose child this was. He did not ask why she had been sent, or what message she carried, or what would happen next. He only waited. If you have been sitting with Jakob at this kitchen for a while now, and if some quiet part of you knows what it is to keep a door unlocked for years without expecting an answer, I would like to ask you something. Drop one word in the comments below. Just one. The first word that comes to mind when you think of someone you have waited for. I read every comment by the fire before I sleep. Now come back to the kitchen with me. The child is still holding the cup. The wheat is still moving in the wind beyond the window. And Jakob, who has been alone for 12 years, has just discovered that what he thought was the end of his story may have been only a long, quiet beginning. The child sat with him for almost 3 hours. The sun moved across the floorboards. The cup of tea grew cold. The silver lines along the child's small arms pulsed in their slow rhythm. And once, when a gust of wind rattled the kitchen window, the child turned its head toward Jakob and looked at him with something that, in a human child, would have been called curiosity. Jakob smiled. He did not know if the child understood smiles. At last, the child slipped down from the chair. It crossed the kitchen with the same soundless step as its mother, if mother was the right word, and at the door it stopped and turned. It looked at Jakob for a long moment. Then it lifted one small lavender hand and pressed it flat against the doorframe, exactly as the Empress had pressed her hand the night she had spoken her last word. Jakob lifted his own hand from the arm of his chair. He pressed it, palm flat, against the wood of the table. He did not know if it was the right answer. He did not know if there was a right answer, but the child's gold-flecked eyes brightened, and the silver lines along its small arms flared once, brightly, and then it opened the door and was gone into the pale afternoon light. That night, Jakob sat by the fire and tried to read. He could not. The words would not stay on the page. He set the book down and stared into the flames and thought about the Empress and the child and the 7 harvest moons and the question the small creature had asked in the wet pasture. The kettle on the stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere out in the dark, the night bird called twice and was answered, this time clearly, by something farther up in the hills. In the morning, he found a small object on the kitchen table. He did not know how it had come to be there. The child had not carried it. He had not seen it set down. But there it was, in the exact center of the table, a small, smooth stone the color of deep violet dusk, threaded with faint silver lines that pulsed slowly, slowly, the way her silver threads had pulsed when she was at ease. Jakob picked the stone up. It was cold in his palm, the way her hand had been cold, and it was almost weightless. He held it for a long time. Then he placed it on the windowsill above the sink, where the sun touched it first in the morning. The silver lines inside the stone brightened in the light and dimmed when a cloud passed, and Jakob understood, in the wordless way old men come to understand such things, that it was a way of saying she was near. The winter came hard that year. Snow fell in great soft sheets that buried the fence posts and bent the apple tree at the south fence and made the dirt road impassable for weeks at a time. Jakob did not mind. He had wood, he had bread, he had tea. He sat by the fire in the long evenings and watched the small stone on the windowsill pulse, its faint silver light, and he was, for the first time in 12 years, not lonely. The Empress came twice that winter. She did not knock, she did not announce herself. The door simply opened, the floorboards did not creak, and she was standing in the kitchen in her long slate cloak with the snow melting from her shoulders. The first time she came, she stayed for an hour and drank 1 cup of tea and watched the snow falling on the field. The second time she stayed for the whole long evening and drank 3 cups. On the second visit she spoke again, not a word this time, a whole sentence in her own tongue, soft and low, like the speaking of a prayer no one was meant to overhear. Jakob did not understand any of it, but she had said his name in the middle of the sentence. Jakob. She had said it carefully, the way the small creature in the pasture had said it, as though it were a word that mattered to her in some way she did not need to explain. He had not known until that moment that she knew his name. He had never told her. He had never told anyone of her kind. But she said it again as she stood at the door to leave, very softly, just the one word now. Jakob. He nodded. He could not speak. She lifted her hand to the door frame in the small gesture that was hers and the child's, and then she was gone, and the snow drifted down through the open door, and Jakob stood watching it for a long time before he closed it. Spring came late, the way it always did on the high plains. The snow ran off in dark rivulets between the wheat stubble, and the apple tree at the south fence put out small green buds, and the night bird returned from wherever it had gone for the cold. Jakob walked the rows of his field with the slow, careful step of a man who is no longer in a hurry. He planted. He waited. He watched the small violet stone on the windowsill pulse its slow silver light. She came again in late spring. She came in summer. She came in early autumn before the harvest moon, and that time she brought the child, and the child sat on the floor by Jakob's chair and traced small patterns on the floorboards with one finger, while the Empress sat in the chair by the window and drank her tea. Jakob did not know what the patterns were. He did not ask. The child looked up at him once, and the gold flecks in its eyes brightened. And that was enough. It was on the third such visit that Jakob noticed the change in the Empress. She had grown thinner. The silver threads along her cheekbones flickered now, in a way they had not flickered before, the way a candle flickers in a draft no one else can feel. She drank her tea slowly. She sat in the chair longer than she used to. She looked out at the field, but Jakob could see that she was no longer looking at the field. She was looking through it. He did not ask. He had never asked. But that evening, as she rose to leave, he reached out one old gnarled hand and let it rest, for the briefest moment, on the back of her cold hand where it lay on the door frame. He did not press. He did not speak. He only let his hand stay there, the way a man holds the hand of a friend at a station before a long parting. She did not pull away. She lowered her head. The silver threads along her temples pulsed once, deeply, and then she turned her hand beneath his and curled her cold fingers around his old warm ones. They stood like that in the doorway for the count of perhaps 10 slow breaths. Then she withdrew her hand. She stepped out into the dusk. The child followed, looking back over its small shoulder until the violet of its cloak was lost in the long evening light. That was the last time the Empress came to his kitchen herself. Jakob did not know it then. He sat down at the table that evening and waited for her to return, the way he had waited every year for 7 years. And somewhere in the slow turning of the season he understood, without being told, that she would not. The small violet stone on the windowsill kept pulsing its slow silver light, but the pulse had slowed and slowed and slowed. 3 weeks later, the child came alone. The child did not climb into the chair by the window. The child stood in the middle of the kitchen with its small gray cloak drawn around its shoulders and looked up at Jakob with eyes that were no longer gold-flecked, but full gold, the way the Empress's eyes had been. The silver lines along its arms had grown stronger, deeper, and they were pulsing in the slow, steady rhythm that, in her, had meant ease. But in the child, here, now, meant something else. The child said one word. Jakob did not understand the word, but he understood the tone. It was the tone in which his own son, long ago, had come to him in the kitchen at the age of 9 and said the dog had died in the night. Jakob lowered himself slowly into his chair. He held out one old hand. The child crossed the kitchen and laid its small lavender hand inside his. They sat that way for a long time. When at last the child left, Jakob walked to the windowsill and picked up the small violet stone. The silver lines inside it were no longer pulsing. They glowed faintly, steadily, the way a coal glows when the fire is gone, but the warmth remains. Jakob held the stone in both hands and stood at the window and watched the wheat moving in the evening wind, and he wept for the second time in 12 years. Quietly, the way old men weep when they have been given a gift they did not know how to refuse. He buried nothing. There was nothing to bury. He simply set the stone back on the windowsill, and he made his tea, and he sat in his chair, and he watched the harvest moon when it came that year, and the chair by the window stayed empty. He did not set out a second cup. He had thought on that night that the long quiet was over, but just past midnight the door opened softly and the child was there. The child was taller now. Not much. But the silver lines along its arms had grown, and the gray cloak had been replaced by a small slate, one the same shade as the Empress's. The child crossed the kitchen with that soundless step and climbed into the chair by the window. And Jakob, who had been sitting with his cold tea in his lap, slowly rose and went to the stove and poured a second cup. He set the cup on the small table, at exactly the distance the Empress had accepted. The child looked at it. The child looked at him. Then the child wrapped its small lavender fingers around the cup and lifted it and breathed in the steam, and the silver lines along its young face brightened and dimmed and brightened in the slow rhythm Jakob had known for 8 harvest moons now, the rhythm of a heart at rest. Jakob sat down across the kitchen. He folded his old hands in his lap. He did not weep this time. He had wept enough. He looked at the child, and the child looked out at the wheat, and the candle burned low between them, and the moon climbed slowly up the window the way it had always climbed. Somewhere out in the field, the night bird called twice and was answered cleanly by something close in the hills. The child did not speak that night. The child drank 1 cup of tea. The child sat in the chair until the moon rested on the western hills, and then the child slipped down and crossed the kitchen and stopped at the door. The child turned. The child lifted one small hand and pressed it flat against the doorframe in the gesture Jakob now knew. He lifted his own hand from the arm of the chair and pressed his palm against the table in answer. The child opened the door, but it did not leave at once. It stood in the open doorway with a silvered field behind it, and it spoke. The voice that came out of its small mouth was not a child's voice. It was older and steadier and clear as a bell across cold water. The child said in careful human words, "She asked me to come every harvest, as she did while I am young. Then my child, then my child's child." Then it stepped out and the door closed. Jakob did not move for a long time. He sat in his chair with his hand still flat on the table and looked at the closed door. Outside, the harvest moon was sliding down behind the hills, and the wheat was moving in the cool wind. And somewhere up in the dark sky, far beyond his old eye's ability to see, he understood now that there were people who knew his name, people who would remember it, people who had chosen generation by generation to come down through the long centuries to the kitchen of a quiet old farmer. They did not need to explain. He stood at last. He washed the 2 cups. He set them on the drying rack side by side. He blew out the candle. He went to the windowsill and picked up the small violet stone, and the silver lines inside it pulsed once, very softly, and then settled into their slow, warm glow. He held the stone in his palm and looked out at the field. He thought of his wife. He thought of his son. He thought of his Empress. The years that came after were quiet, the way good years are quiet. The child came every harvest moon and grew and brought small gifts that Jakob did not always understand, but always accepted. A piece of cloth, the color of deep water, a small carved figure of a creature with too many legs, a folded sheet of paper covered in writing that Jakob could not read but kept pinned above the stove for the rest of his days. Jakob grew older. His knee got worse. The harvest got smaller. Then he hired a young man from the next valley to bring in the wheat, and finally a second young man to take the first one's place. The kitchen stayed the same. The chair by the window stayed in its place. The kettle on the stove still hummed. The small violet stone on the windowsill still pulsed its slow silver light. Some things in his life had changed, and some things had not, and Jakob had stopped trying to know which would do which. One spring, a small craft came down in his lower pasture, larger than the first one had been, and out of it stepped not one creature, but several. They wore long cloaks of slate and silver, and they walked across the wet grass in a slow procession, and at their center walked the child, who was no longer a child now, but a tall, slim figure, with the full silver lines pulsing along its arms and throat in the rhythm Jakob had known all his old life. Jakob met them at the edge of the pasture in his coat and his old hat. He did not bow. He did not know how to bow to whatever it was the child had become. He only inclined his head in the small way he had inclined it to the Empress on the first harvest moon, and the tall figure inclined its head in return. Exactly the same fraction of an inch, the way its mother had done 8 harvest moons ago. "Farmer Jakob," the tall figure said, in clear human words now, with the practiced ease of someone who had studied for many years. "I have come to ask one thing of you. May we mark this place, may we mark it, not with a stone or a sign or a banner, only in our records, only in the books of my people, so that those who come after us will know, so that they will keep coming." Jakob looked at the tall, slim figure for a long time. He thought of his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, who had built the foundation of the kitchen with stones from the river. He thought of his wife, who had asked him not to be alone. He thought of his son beneath the apple tree at the south fence. He thought of the Empress, who had walked into his kitchen one harvest moon and refused to explain why. He thought of the long quiet he had kept. "Mark it," he said. His voice was thin now, the voice of an old man near the end of a long road. "Mark it so they keep coming. Even after I am gone, the kettle will be where I left it. The door will not be locked. The door will not be locked." The tall figure lowered its head. The silver lines along its throat brightened deeply, the way the Empress's had brightened the night she had spoken her last word. Then it stepped forward and laid one cool lavender hand against Jakob's old cheek. It was the only time anyone of her people ever touched his face. He stood very still beneath the touch, the way a man stands under a benediction whose meaning he does not need to know. Then the tall figure stepped back. It turned. It walked back across the wet pasture to the small craft. The others followed. The craft rose silently into the gray spring sky and was gone, and Jakob stood in the pasture in his old coat and watched the empty sky for a long time. He lived 4 more years after that. They were quiet years, the way good years are quiet. The child, who was no longer a child, came every harvest moon and brought its own child the last 2 years. A small lavender thing with gold-flecked eyes and silver lines just beginning to form along its arms. They sat in the chair by the window, the 2 of them, the elder holding the younger, and Jakob poured the tea and the candle burned low. On the last harvest moon of his life, Jakob did not get up from his chair when the door opened. He was tired, his old knee hurt. He sat in his chair by the fire and watched as the tall, slim figure crossed the kitchen and lifted the small child up into the chair by the window. And the small child looked at him with gold-flecked eyes. And Jakob smiled, and the small child smiled back. It was the first smile he had ever seen from her people. The tall figure poured the tea that night. Jakob watched from his chair. He saw his own kitchen the way the Empress must have seen it that first harvest moon, 8 harvests and many years ago. He saw the kettle on the stove, the cups on the shelf, the candle on the small table, the chair by the window. He saw the small violet stone on the windowsill pulsing its slow silver light. He saw the door, unlocked. He saw all of it, and he understood, finally, what she had been looking at all those long, quiet years. She had been looking at a place where she could simply be. She had not needed the kitchen for shelter, or for food, or for any of the small old reasons a person comes through a door. She had come because the door had been open, because the cup had been poured, because the old man at the table had not asked her to be anything but what she was, and her child after her, and her child's child. Jakob closed his eyes in his chair by the fire. The tall figure noticed. She crossed the kitchen and knelt beside him, the way her mother had once knelt by the empty cup, and she took his old hand in her cool lavender hands. She did not speak. She only held his hand in her cool lavender hands. She did not speak. She only held his hand. the small child watched from the chair by the window, gold-flecked eyes wide and steady, learning, the way children of any people learn, what it is to sit beside someone at the end. He went quietly. The kettle was on the stove. The cup was poured. The candle was burning. The small violet stone on the windowsill pulsed once, very softly, and went still. Outside, the harvest moon was at its highest, full and orange and patient, and somewhere in the wheat the nightbird called twice and was answered cleanly by something close in the hills. The tall, slim figure lowered her head over his hand and stayed there for a long time. She did not weep, because her people did not weep in the way humans wept. But the silver lines along her throat dimmed and stayed dim for many slow breaths. Then she rose. She lifted the small child from the chair by the window. She carried the small child to the table and let the small child press one small lavender hand flat against the wood, where Jakob had pressed his hand the night his life had quietly turned. They buried him beneath the apple tree at the south fence beside his son and his wife. The neighbors came from 4 miles down the dirt road. They did not understand why the tall, slim figure in the sleek cloak stood at the head of the grave and spoke a single sentence in a language none of them knew. They did not understand the small child she held, or the silver lines that pulsed slowly along its arms, or the small violet stone she set on the headstone where the sun would touch it first. They did not need to understand. The land kept its secrets. The kitchen stayed where it had always been. The kettle stayed on the stove. The door stayed unlocked, the way Jakob had asked. And every harvest moon, the tall figure came, and then her child, and then her child's child, and the chair by the window was never empty for long, and the small violet stone on the windowsill kept its slow silver light through all the long, quiet years that came after. There is a kitchen on the high plains where the wheat moves slow in the wind. The door is never locked. The kettle is always on the stove. And on the night of the harvest moon, if you walked up the dirt road and looked through the window, you would see 2 cups on the small table and a candle burning low, and a tall, slim figure in a slate cloak sitting in the chair by the window, looking out at the field as though she had been waiting a long time and had finally come home. If you have stayed with me all the way to this kitchen, all the way to the apple tree at the south fence, and the small violet stone on the windowsill, then I want to thank you quietly, the way an old man thanks a friend who has walked a long road beside him without needing to be told why. If this story warms something in you, leave a like before you go. It tells the algorithm to find the next quiet listener who needs it. If you would like more stories told this way, slow and by the fire, with no shouting and no rush, subscribe to HFY Hearth and tap the small bell beside the subscribe button so the next one finds you when it is ready. The bell is a small thing. It is a kindness. The way Jakob's open door was a kindness. I would be honored if you turned it on tonight. In comments below, I would love to know one thing. Of all the harvest moons in Jakob's kitchen, which one stayed with you the longest? Was it the first one when she stood dripping in the doorway? Was it the night she spoke his name? Was it the small child climbing into her mother's empty chair? Tell me. I read every comment before I sleep, by my own quiet fire. The next story I am preparing is about a lighthouse keeper on a sea planet coast who finds a wounded thing washed up among the rocks one cold winter morning, and the slow, strange friendship that follows through 3 long years of storms. I think you will like it. It will be ready soon. Stay warm until then. Keep your own door a little unlocked if you can. Good night from the hearth, my friend. Sleep well wherever you are listening from tonight. The kettle is on. The chair by the window is empty, but only for now. The harvest moon is rising somewhere, slow and orange and patient. And somewhere, in some quiet kitchen, an old man is washing one plate at the sink, and the door is about to open, and the long, quiet good thing is about to begin again.